negatives or limited cases, but they all had the same basic structure. The major premise is followed by a minor premise, which leads to a conclusion. Thus, no philosophers are dunces. Some humans are philosophers. Therefore, some humans are not dunces. To our present way of thinking, this type of argument appears hopelessly cumbersome, and liable to lead to all kinds of woolly thought, but in its day it represented a categorical advance in human thinking, of a magnitude that has remained unsurpassed before or since. That is not to say it doesn't have certain definite flaws. For instance, the syllogism, all horses are animals. All horses have hooves. Therefore some animals have hooves. This argument is valid only if there are such things as horses, as is shown by the following syllogism of the same structure. All unicorns are horses. All unicorns have horns. Therefore, some horses have horns. Aristotle called his logic analytica, which means unravelling. Every science or field of knowledge had to start from a set of first principles or axioms. From these its truths could be deduced by logic, or unravelled. These axioms defined the subject's field of activity, separating it from irrelevant or incompatible elements. Biology and poetry, for instance, started from mutually exclusive premises. Thus, mythical beasts were not a part of biology, and biology had no need to be written in the form of poetry. This logical approach released entire fields of knowledge, giving them the potential to discover whole new sets of truths. It was to be 2 millennia before these definitions became a stranglehold, restricting the development of human knowledge. Aristotle's thinking was philosophy through many centuries to come, and in the Middle Ages it came to be regarded as gospel, preventing further development. Aristotle's thinking may have built the intellectual edifice of the medieval world, but it was hardly his fault that this eventually became a prison. Aristotle himself would never have allowed this. His works are littered with the kinds of inconsistencies that show a continually questioning and developing mind. He preferred research into the actual workings of the world to mere speculation about its nature. Even his mistakes often appear to have a poetic insight. Anger is the boiling of blood around the heart. The eye is made blue by the sky. In true Greek fashion, he saw education as the way forward for humanity, believing that an educated man differed from an uneducated one as much as the living from the dead. Yet his understanding of the place of education was not that of a shallow optimist. It is an ornament in prosperity and a refuge in adversity. He may have ended a bit of a pedant, but he gives indication of having known his share of suffering. He remained a teacher throughout his life and never sought to hold public office, yet no man throughout human history has ever had such a lasting effect on the world. In this we are fortunate, for Aristotle seems to have been a good man. He saw the goal of humanity as the pursuit of happiness, which he defined as the actualization of the best we are capable of. But what is the best we are capable of? In Aristotle's view, reason is man's highest faculty. Therefore, the best and happiest man spends as much of his time as possible in the purest activity of reason, which is theorizing. This is very much an innocent professorial view of happiness, hedonism as a purely theoretical pursuit. A few in the real world would subscribe to such a view, and those who do don't seem to be any happier than the thoughtless Philistine enjoying his lottery winnings. Similar objections apply to Aristotle's view that we should try to actualize what we do best. It is arguable that his famous pupil Alexander sought the actualization of the best he was capable of, inflicting suffering and death on countless thousands in the process. Yet it can also be argued that Aristotle sought to check such moral excesses with his famous doctrine of the golden mean. According to this idea, every virtue is the mean between two extremes. This recalls the traditional Greek concept of moderation, mentioned even in the works of Homer, who predated Aristotle by some 500 years, and described events that had taken place a millennium before the philosopher's birth. The early Greeks, and indeed the later ancient Greeks, were in great need of a concept of moderation. Nothing too much was soon adopted as one of their chief maxims of moral guidance. Such was their abundant energy that when it was not channeled into creative endeavours, it frequently found outlet in excess. The frenzied and orgiastic behaviour associated with the worshippers of Dionysius, the dark aspects of character and ritual that persisted into Greek tragedy, the terrors and superstitions of everyday life, these are the shadow side of the early classical era. For philosophy, mathematics, and artistic excellence to emerge from such chaos, supreme moderation was required. Characteristically, Pythagoras even tried to ally this moderation to mathematics, so that the virtue between two extremes could be calculated. Everything without measure or unmeasurable, such as infinity, was evil. Exactitude became a virtue. Strong elements of this remain recognizable in Western morality to this day. Plato, with his love of the mathematical and the abstract, appears to go along with much of this. Aristotle, on the other hand, was against the mathematical approach to morals. It was not possible to calculate what is good. The good was not to be determined by purely abstract considerations. It was more akin to the harmony found in a work of art. Moral virtue was a mean between two extremes, but this depended more upon a person's nature and the situation in which he found himself. To kill a man on the battlefield was different from killing one on the street, and even here, if you killed him in the furtherance of a robbery, it was different from doing so if he had grievously wronged you. Along with Aristotle's view of harmony came a necessary element of relativism, and this too exhibited moderation. The difficulty arises when you attempt to formulate this morality in any detail. If, according to the golden mean, every virtue lies between two extremes, what precisely are these extremes? Without ancient Greek fervour and intimacy with dangerous extremes, such a doctrine leads only to mediocrity or verbal juggling. To call telling the truth halfway between telling a lie and correcting a falsehood is ingenious but ethically vacuous. Aristotle didn't maintain this, but would have needed to come up with something like it to fill the gap in his argument. During Aristotle's later years, his wife Pythias died. Marriage obviously suited him, for he now married his maidservant Harpyllis, who was to be the mother of his first son, Nicomachus. In 323 BC, news reached Athens that Alexander had died in Babylon at the end of a prolonged drinking bout with his generals. The Athenians had long resented being under the domination of the uncultured Macedonians, and at Alexander's death they gave vent to their feelings. Aristotle, who had been born in Macedonia and was renowned for having tutored its ablest son, became a victim of this wave of anti-Macedonian feeling. He was arraigned on a trumped-up charge of impiety. His accuser, Eurymedon the Hierophant, citing the eulogy he had written 20 years earlier on the death of his benefactor, the eunuch Hermias of Atanius. This had contained the lines, "Sons of the gods strove for thee, and their heroes returned to the earth, all for thy love and thee to see." This was hardly impiety, but the mob required victims. If Aristotle had stood trial, he would certainly have been sentenced to death. But Aristotle was not made of the same stuff as Socrates. He had no inclination toward martyrdom. Wisely, he fled the city to prevent Athens from sinning twice against philosophy. This was no easy decision. It involved Aristotle abandoning his beloved Lyceum forever. Deprived of his library and access to his research archives, the aging philosopher now retired to property in Chalkis, which he had inherited from his father. This city lies 30 miles north of Athens, on the long island of Euboea, at the point where it is separated from the mainland by a narrow channel. The waters of this channel are subject to an unexplained phenomenon. Despite the Aegean being virtually tideless, a rapid current runs through the channel, changing direction for no accountable reason as many as a dozen times a day. A persistent local myth has it that Aristotle spent many days racking his brains for an explanation of this phenomenon, and when, for the first time in his life, he found himself defeated, he jumped into the water and drowned. More reliable historical sources record that Aristotle died in 322 BC at the age of 63, a year after arriving in Chalkis. He is said to have died of a stomach illness, though one source claims he committed suicide by drinking aconite, needlessly cumbersome, and liable to lead to all kinds of woolly thought, but in its day it represented a categorical advance in human thinking, of a magnitude that has remained unsurpassed before or since. That is not to say it doesn't have certain definite flaws. For instance, the syllogism, all horses are animals. All horses have hooves. Therefore some animals negatives or limited cases, but they all had the same basic structure. The major premise is followed by a minor premise, which leads to a conclusion. Thus, no philosophers are dunces. Some humans are philosophers. Therefore, some humans are not dunces. To our present way of thinking, this type of argument appears hopeless to have hooves. This argument is valid only if there are such things as horses, as is shown by the following syllogism of the same structure. All unicorns are horses. All unicorns have horns. Therefore, some horses have horns. Aristotle called his logic analytica, which means unravelling. Every science or field of knowledge had to start from a set of first principles or axioms. From these its truths could be deduced by logic, or unravelled. These axioms defined the subject's field of activity, separating it from irrelevant or incompatible elements. Biology and poetry, for instance, started from mutually exclusive premises. Thus, mythical beasts were not a part of biology, and biology had no need to be written in the form of poetry. This logical approach released entire fields of knowledge, giving them the potential to discover whole new sets of truths. It was to be 2 millennia before these definitions